This week, for our Misty Morning Sew-Along, we're making block number 8. You'll be making 12 blocks this week, and we're going to be using fabric C and the background fabric. Now, I know that fabric C is, in my case, this little dit dot, because the dark blue corresponds with the illustration, and on my chart, that indicates that it's this dit dot fabric. So select your fabric C and your background fabric. Now, all of our blocks are made up of squares that are cut 2.5 inches and half square triangles that are 2.5 inches from raw edge to raw edge. We're about halfway through this program, and this is the first time that we've used fabric C, so you have plenty of fabric. But I want you to make note of a few things on the instructions. Number 1, it says from fabric C cut 2 strips 2.5 inches by the width of fabric. And from these strips cut 36 squares 2.5 inches. Well, as a designer, I know that I can always cut 16 squares from one 2.5 inch strip because I work on a 40-inch usable width of fabric base. You might be able to cut more squares from yours, but you need 36. So those 2 strips are going to leave you about 4 short of what you actually need to make your 12 blocks. You have a half a yard of fabric, so you have more fabric than you're going to possibly need to do this, but adding a 3rd strip in there to be able to cut 4 more squares seems like a bit of a waste to me. So hang with me here for a minute while we cut the rest of our pieces. It also says you need 1 strip 6.5 inches by 27 inches. And remember, those 3 little asterisks there refer to this, which is the cut that you would need if you're using triangles on a roll. If you use the triangles on a roll, the strip of paper that you'll cut will be a little less than 27 inches. So if you cut a 6.5 inch strip across the width of your fabric, then you can cut the piece that you need to be able to make your half square triangles. The rest of that strip can be used, just a part of it, to be able to cut those extra 2.5 inch squares that you need from both your background fabric and your fabric C. So both of those can be cut. So you're going to need the 2 strips that are listed there, plus 4 more squares. So you can cut those squares from wherever you want. And also remember, I'm using the triangles on a roll method. If you're using a different method, you don't need to cut that. You need to cut exactly what you need following the instructions for the method that you're using to make your half square triangles. So now when we put them together, one more tip. Because you're cutting the 2 strips 2.5 by width of fabric from both your C fabric and your background fabric, those squares are going to end up being sewn together here and here. So if you would like, you can just go ahead and sew them together before you cut. So if you sew your 2 strips together, sew one set with this seam pressed towards the C fabric and one towards the background fabric. And then when you cross cut those into 2.5 inch sections, you can replace these. So instead of cutting squares, they will already be sewn together for you. Now, if you look at the pressing instructions that are down here on the bottom of our page, you'll see that these seams are to be pressed out and these seams are to be pressed out, meaning one set will have to be pressed towards the C fabric and one set will have to be pressed towards the background fabric. Now, if you press them all in the same direction, it doesn't matter. You can just go back and repress them as you're sewing your rows together. But then what we're going to do is sew the triangles together. The center unit, these are pressed out, so this would get pressed in, and then these will be sewn together, and they are pressed out. Now, once we've sewn these units together, we're going to press them out as well. Now that might seem counterintuitive to some of you who are used to always pressing towards the dark, But for this project, because of the way our blocks lay out, if we press every other row in the same direction, so odd number of rows get pressed in, even number rows get pressed out, then all of our seams will nest in our final assembly. So for this week, you're going to be making 36 half square triangles of fabric C and the background. You'll be cutting 36 squares of fabric C, either using the pre-pieced method or simply cutting squares, and the same from your background fabric. And then we'll sew them together to create 12 of block number 8.